Start. All right, so let's dive into the agenda. What we'll be covering here today is welcome and introductions, where you'll hear from the BDSS team, from the training team, get to know us, and then we'll do some polls through Mentee to get to know who's in the room and get some information from you all. We'll then spend the bulk of this training session on establishing the FYI initiative and how to do so, and all the parts required to getting started. So that includes establishing partnership agreements, what those are, how they work, and how to go about creating one and establishing a partnership. We'll then talk about the supportive service requirements by HUD and how you can go about navigating those and finding information on that and finding partners for those supportive services. We'll then go into some stakeholder-specific steps. So for our PHAs, updating administrative plans, and for our local Department of Social Services, talking about referrals and how to go about prioritizing those. And then we'll go through the voucher application process for both the competitive and non-competitive processes. We'll then move into the FYI life cycle and best practices, where we'll do a brief overview of the life cycle and the steps of FYI, which we covered in depth in FYI 101. So if you need a refresher, feel free to watch that training. But here we'll do a brief overview of that and then focus on best practices during each of those phases. And then we'll go into increasing awareness of FYI and close out with a survey and a few other items and Q&A. So let's move into our welcome and introductions, and I will pass it over to the BDSS team to introduce themselves.
Welcome and thanks for attending the FYI 201 Beyond the Basic training today. My name is Letha Moore Jones, and I am the State Independent Living Coordinator and Youth Services Supervisor with Virginia Department of Social Services. I also have with me today Monica Cabell and Gwen Castillo. They are State Youth Services Program Specialists and who are part of the core BDSS FYI team. Most of you know that many of our young people with lived experience in foster care faces housing insecurity. According to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, nationwide, 50% of the homeless population has spent time in foster care. An estimated 20% of young adults who are in care become homeless the moment they are emancipated at age 18. I have been in this position 23 years. I know, and many of you know, from data and direct experience, that many youth who transition out of foster care struggle to find permanent, affordable, and stable housing. However, there is a vital resource called Foster Youth to Independence, FYI for short, housing vouchers, for the population to provide support with housing. Unfortunately, we learned that there are barriers that have caused the FYI voucher to be underutilized here in Virginia. We hope to change that soon so youth and young adults will have access to housing wherever they want to live in the state. We realize we cannot do this work by ourselves. That is why we need you. This work requires a strong collaboration with community partners. We are excited you are here and hope you accept the call to action to help our young people access FYI vouchers. At this time, I will pass it to Guidehouse, an important member of our FYI team, to introduce themselves and provide today's training.
Great. Thank you so much, Letha. I will kick us off. My name is Victoria Haugen, and I'm an Associate Director with Guidehouse. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, Guidehouse is a global advisory, technology, and managed services firm. And although we are a global firm, we're actually headquartered in Tysons, Virginia, nearby. And we have a big presence here in the Virginia area. And we were fortunate enough to have the opportunity to partner with VDSS to bring this important training series to you all, like Letha mentioned. I'm personally based in Richmond, and I'm part of our local team focused on serving our state and local government clients across the state. And I will kick it off to Jamie.
Hi everyone, Jamie Muth. I'm part of Guidehouse's Housing and Community Solutions team. We support a number of housing agencies and housing finance agencies optimize their programs across the nation. In my prior life, I supported one of the largest housing authorities in the country provide FYI to foster youth and coordinate the grants management process for that program as well. So excited to be here. I'll pass it to Atticus.
Hi, everyone. I'm also part of Guidehouse's Housing and Community Solutions team. I'm very excited to be on this training with all of you, as I also come from a major housing authority. So it's exciting to still be doing this work and connecting people with these resources. And I'm looking forward to doing the training with you all today. And I'll pass it to Shelley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shelley Cohen. I work with Guidehouse's state and local government team and major focus on training. And so I'm really excited to be, one of the members here delivering the training here today. So now that you know all of us, we want to do some polls to get to know the rest of you who are in the room. So we'll have a series of those. If we can go ahead and share those mentee polls. Awesome. So if you can go to mentee.com and type in the code, you should be able to start filling out, who you are and where you come from. I can also drop that pin in the chat, which should be helpful. Oh, Monica dropped the link, so feel free to click that. That will take you directly to the polls. We'll use this throughout the training for a few different polls. But you can open it up on another browser if it's easier for you to have it on your phone. You can do that as well. But this is a great way to kind of see who's in the room. I'll give a little extra time with this poll because it's our first one to see, so you all can kind of get set up, because I know it can kind of take a little longer on the first one. But it looks like we have a bunch of people coming from LDSSs. These are our largest group. With some scattered representation as well from BDSS, public housing authorities, local housing agencies, supportive services, and some other as well. So please continue to respond as we go through these polls. In addition, if you want to write your name, your role, and your agency in the chat, so we have a more descriptions of who's here, that would be great as well. Monica, if we could go to the next poll to get a feel of what geographic region people are coming from. So if you click that mentee link, it should now pop up the next question. And should be able to click on the image where exactly you all are coming from, which I think is a cool tool to see where our representation is coming from. Awesome. It looks like we have a bunch of people coming from the central region, really representation from all over, which is great. So hopefully also by seeing everyone's names in the chat, you can build some connections with people in your localities as well. But I see we still have a few more trickling in. We'll just give another couple moments to see, where people are coming from. And as a reminder, if you somehow get disconnected from the poll, you can again join at mentee.com and then put in that code. All right, let's move to the next one. Okay, why are you attending this training and what do you hope to gain from the training? So you can, on the mentee, just write in some words and we'll see what kind of our most popular things that people are trying to gain from the training here today. Knowledge and information are right up there. Ways to help youth. Resources. Implementing a program will really be focusing on that. So that's great to hear. Some assistance, knowledge, new opportunities, understanding. So really huge focus here on gaining knowledge and resources and learning how to implement a program, which is great because that's what we're going to be covering today. Let's see what else is slowly trickling in. things are moving so fast, hard to keep track of everything. Some updates of the program, we'll talk about that as well. Partnerships, a focus of this as well. So I'm excited to cover all of this information today. Okay, we can move to the next question. Is there an active FYI initiative in your geographic area? So there we have yes and no, and then we have no with more details. No, but we're working to establish an MOU. No, but we used to have an MOU in place. And if you can use the Mentee to respond, it's super helpful so we can see an aggregate number of responses. Again, it's mentee.com and you type in that code. A lot of uncertainty here, which is interesting to note. A few representing who do have FYI, that's good to have here, and maybe can share some information in the chat about their best practices and things like that. But a lot of no's and unsure, so that's good and helpful for us to know as we are delivering this training. Okay, I will, as we see those last, feel free to respond to that last this question, have a few more trickle in, and then we are going to go ahead and move forward, but this poll should remain open. Okay, awesome. So jump through our poll questions, and our first section here is FYI initiative establishment. So I know some of you may have attended the FYI 101 training. This has been familiar for you, or you're trying to go beyond the basics, but wanted to provide just a brief overview of competitive and non-competitive funding, and the two different types that you can go about getting FYI vouchers. So before we go into the establishment of FYI and establishing that initiative, that process will vary based off of competitive and non-competitive funding and which one you're going about. So as a reminder, what is the difference? So non-competitive vouchers are on-demand vouchers. So how they work is you identify a youth, you then request a voucher for that specific youth using the application request form. You can initially request up to 25 vouchers in the beginning of the federal fiscal year. And that's a smaller amount than the competitive voucher. So competitive funding, you can get up to 75 vouchers, but it is a more competitive process. You do have to respond to a notice of funding opportunity that is released by HUD. You respond to that with kind of a full application there. So that's just a brief overview of those two sources of funding. So when you're establishing FYI, in your locality, these are the steps that you need to take. So the first thing is you need to establish a partnership agreement. So that means first identifying the PHA, the Public Housing Authority, the local Department of Social Services, and then if you are working with a supportive services partner, then you need them as well, and bringing the entities together to establish a letter of intent or a memorandum of understanding. Once you've come together, the Public Housing Authority will then update their administrative plan. And at this point in the process, if you are applying for competitive funding, this is when you would submit your application to HUD and hopefully receive funding. You will then, or the LDSS specifically, will develop a system of prioritization for referral, so how they go about referring youth to the PHA, and then identifying need. However, for a non-competitive process, you'll go through all 4 of these steps and then fill out that application form and then hopefully receive the funding. So the main difference here is that for non-competitive FYI, you will have to identify the youth prior to applying. So we're now going to walk through each of these steps in more detail and hopefully provide more context to go about doing all of these steps. So establishing partnership agreements is first. So The partnership agreement will be among 2 or more entities, right? We have the local Department of Social Services that plays a key role here. In this presentation, and you will get these slides, we've linked to a lot of HUD materials. And HUD, the specific role here is the Public Child Welfare Agency. So if you see PCWA throughout HUD materials, just wanted to flag that the LDSS will always serve this role in Virginia. So if you're looking at those materials, just keep that in mind. Right, the other partner is the Public Housing Authority that is focused on requesting vouchers and providing vouchers to youth. If neither of these entities are able to provide the supportive services, then there will also be the supportive services provider as a third-party entity. Again, the language used by HUD is third party. We will be using supportive service providers throughout this presentation. So these 3 stakeholders in the administrative side of FYI, just wanted to go over an overview of what these stakeholders do in the process. So let's start with the local Department of Social Services. The LDSS will identify youth. They'll then check their eligibility and make sure they meet, those minimum requirements of FYI. After that, they'll refer the youth to the PHA and certify that they've met those eligibility requirements. And then the last main responsibility is either to provide the supportive services required by HUD or secure an entity to do so. So the supportive services provider, this third-party entity, can also identify eligible youth, but their main responsibility is really providing those direct supportive services to youth. Then we have the Public Housing Authority, and again, they can also identify youth. That is, something that any entity here can do. It is just the LDSS has to go through that eligibility and certification process, but they generally receive that referral. They'll either put that youth on a wait list, or if they don't need to put them on the wait list and can push them through, they will do that. And then during the life cycle, another responsibility of theirs is just to make sure that youth are aware of the supportive services that are offered to them and how they can access those supportive services. And lastly, they do everything voucher related. So, they apply for those vouchers, they get the funding, they issue the vouchers and distribute the HAP funds. So those are the stakeholders who are involved in the FYI initiative and who must be included in the partnership agreement. So when you're, thinking about your partnerships in general, some things to think about is developing clear roles and responsibilities. So the reason that this is a guiding principle is because it's important to have ownership over tasks, right? You have multiple people coming here together, and it's not necessarily clear who's going to do what, right? So if you, can establish an FYI liaison, so a main point of contact at each agency, or organization, and they'll serve as the main point of contact to get things done at their entity. So let's say you have one person at the LDSS, and kind of really defining what these points of contact are doing, so that things can be move along and things don't fall through the crack and people are like, oh, I thought you were going to do that, I thought you were going to do that. So really, establishing clear roles and responsibilities are always helpful in partnerships. Another item is just, compliance. Always make sure that you're complying with any requirements so that you don't hit any issues there. When we're talking about partnering with youth specifically, just make sure that they're aware of everything that's going on, engage them, and make them feel engaged. It's not just like, okay, we'll give them the minimum information, but really make them involved in the decision-making process, because when they're actively engaged, when they feel like an active participant in the process, that's going to really make this a stronger partnership between all of these entities and with the youth who you're ultimately serving through this program. The next thing I want to talk about, another guiding principle, is utilizing data effectively. And I think this one is, really important when you're thinking about kind of tracking the progress and improvements of your program. So one thing that you can do in a partnership is share data across the different entities. And that can kind of help you like monitor and track towards your goals. And in addition to that, this last thing here, like continually monitoring and improving, right? Data goes a long way when you're thinking about, how can we improve this partnership? How can we improve this program? When you have metrics and when you have data to look at, that can give you insights on, what you can do better, what you're doing really well. So setting, a meeting on a regular cadence, maybe it's every 4 months that you come together, the different partners come together to meet and discuss this, can be really useful in improving your program. Okay, so, when you're going about establishing these partnership agreements, you need to locate those partners. And so maybe you're a PHA looking for an LDSS or vice versa. So hopefully we can provide some resources here today. So if you're looking for a local Department of Social Services as a partner, you can reach out to VDSS to ask them for help connecting you to the right point of contact. That Gwen here can be the point of contact for you all at VDSS. Email is on the screen. We will get these slides as reference if you need for later on. But if you're unsure who to go to, where to go to, Gwen is the person there to connect you with someone at an LDSS. If you're looking for a public housing authority to partner with, HUD does publish a list with the list of PHAs and a point of contact at those PHAs. So you can go ahead and reference that material as well to see, where's the locality. Okay, I found this locality in Virginia, and this is the point of contact that I want to get in touch with. The last thing is looking for supportive services, and we will go into detail into how to navigate this in the next section. So we'll kind of hold off on that. So now let's talk about the partnership agreement itself. We talked about the partners, we talked about guiding principles, we talked about finding the partners. Now let's talk about actually getting this partnership agreement together. So there are two types of partnership agreements. There are memorandums of understanding and letters of intent. The main difference here is that, letters of intent tend to be briefer and simpler. And because competitive FYI has, higher thresholds generally for their applications, an MOU is the only thing that can be used for that competitive application. So again, they both establish collaboration between the entities. Letters of intent can only be used for non-competitive applications. They cannot be used for competitive applications, while MOUs can be used for both. So in these documents, you'll have a few sections. So first, you'll want to define the eligible youth. So, what are the requirements to be in this program? Who is eligible? Who is our target population? Things like that. You'll then move into your supportive services, the requirements by HUD, listing those out and saying, okay, these are the supportive services, and this is who is going to be providing each of them. It can be multiple providers who are providing the supportive services. It doesn't have to be just one entity. And then you'll go into, the partners at the table, each of their responsibilities. So the PHA, the LDSS, and the supportive services provider, and outline each responsibility. And there is some, some guidance by HUD, and we'll share, a link to a template later on as well that can help you outline these responsibilities and just take note of, generally what should be included in these sections. So, as I had mentioned before, an MOU does require some additional information for a competitive application. So if you are going the competitive route and you need to establish an MOU, you also need to include this strategic piece. I will really frame it around that, is like talking about your goals and measuring success and having targets, things like that. Those are the things that need to be included in the MOU for a competitive application. The one other thing I wanted to note is that for a competitive application, MOUs are reviewed. So in a non-competitive application, the letter of intent or MOU is not reviewed by HUD, but when it comes to a competitive application, it will be reviewed in completion by HUD to make sure it has all the parts that are required. So here we have just some samples for you all to reference later on in this, when you go about this. If you are creating partnership agreements, we have a sample letter of intent and a sample memorandum of understanding. It has the sections broken out, and I know it might be small on your screen right now, but when you open the documents, you'll see, it really breaks out each section, and it tells you, okay, insert the name of the PHA staff member, insert the name of the local Department of Social Services. So it's really a template, and this can make it easier on you all to go about establishing those partnership agreements. So one thing to note is a statement of cooperation. We talked about a strategic piece is required to be a part of a partnership agreement. So the MOU for a competitive application. It's not required for non-competitive FYI, but it is recommended, to create a strategic program is preferred. And this can help you think about your strategy in implementing that program. So it's not just, the statement of cooperation isn't just like, we're committed to working together to administer this program. It really focuses on the goals and standards of success. And this is another point here, when I was talking about utilizing data as a guiding principle, like this is something that you can use that data for to track your goals and, how you are moving towards your goals once you've established that program. And if you have a data sharing agreement between the entities, tracking that can be easier. And then the last thing here that's required for partnership agreements for competitive FYI is setting those FYI liaisons. So again, not required for non-competitive FYI, but definitely recommended to include that in your partnership agreement as well. So just summarizing some best practices I just mentioned, throughout, is that, the process is complex. We're having a 2-hour training on this process of establishing FYI initiatives, and there is a high administrative burden. So just doing some things to make it easier for yourselves. One of which that I discussed was the FYI liaisons, and then also sharing data and trying to reduce that administrative burden by doing so can be super helpful. So I just want to highlight a couple of things about what Virginia Beach does. We talked about this in FYI 101, so you may remember and may be familiar with this, with their initiative there. But just a few things to highlight is, they are a partnership of 3 entities, the Department of Human Services and the Department of Housing and Preservation, as well as Connect with a Wish, who provides the supportive services. They're a nonprofit entity that is self-funded. But, we're here talking about partnership agreements, and I think it's really important to note that they had a harder time in the beginning establishing their initiative. It used to take them a long time to get those vouchers in the hands of youth. And they have been really successful in enhancing and improving their initiative, and it's all due to that partnership. And they have those liaisons. They meet regularly, and they really implement those best practices. And so they attribute so much of their success to being able to work together really well. And then another thing I wanted to focus on is, we talk about a lot of times about what's required of the LDSS or the PHA. And there are requirements for these supportive service providers of what they need to provide, right? Those basic things. But if a if a supportive service provider can go above and beyond, that we've seen can really, really strengthen a program. And so Connect with the Wish really stands by the youth every step of the way. They are helping them look for a unit. They're at briefings with them. They help them furnish up their apartments. They help them with their security deposits, and that additional support that goes above and beyond is one of the reasons that they think that, they've been able to get so many vouchers leased up. The next case study I wanted to highlight is in Central Virginia. And so this model is a little different. Basically, it's the Fredericksburg Department of Social Services working with the Central Virginia Housing Coalition. And then Project Belong, again, is it's a nonprofit providing those supportive services. So Fredericksburg decided to regionalize the administration of FYI. So what does that mean? Basically, they established a partnership agreement with the Central Virginia Housing Coalition, which includes 6 counties. So Fredericksburg is only one of the 6 counties it falls within the jurisdiction of the Central Virginia Housing Coalition. So by regionalizing this administration and streamlining all of the referrals through the Fredericksburg LDSS, they've seen an increase in FYI referrals, which is really cool and a really cool way to think about reducing administrative burden and getting more vouchers. So just wanted to share a quote from the Family Services Supervisor at the Fredericksburg Department of Social Services. They say, the FYI initiative provides crucial housing assistance to young adults aging out of foster care, ensuring they have a stable foundation to transition into independent living. It's a crucial step to breaking the cycle of homelessness and empowering young adults to build a secure future. We learned early on that these young adults not only needed housing assistance, but also needed lifelong connections. So we partnered with Project Belong, Don't Go Alone, which has provided each young adult with mentoring. Since implementing this program in Fredericksburg in 2021, we have referred 60 young adults for the FYI voucher. So that's just really amazing to see that Fredericksburg has such a successful program, and the thing that I had noted before, really the enhancement and value that these supportive service providers really play in this initiative is super, super important. So we'll now jump into our next poll, just a quick poll about our partnership agreements. So which of the following are best practices? So again, you can jump into that Menti and select the question, the answer that you think is correct. And just a reminder, I know that I'm going through a lot of material and we're trying to give you all this information as fast as we can in our 2-hour training. Just a reminder that it is recorded. You can always go back and listen to any sections that you have additional questions on. And again, with that recording, we will be sharing the slides, so you will have access to those as well. Okay, which of the following are best practices? We have here share FYI related data across agencies in the partnership agreement. Yes, that is correct. And I could see maybe this one was a little tricky because we have include a statement of cooperation in the partnership agreement, which is the best practice for non-competitive. It is a requirement for competitive applications. I would still consider it a best practice, but something to note there as well. Okay, we are now going to move into our next section, which will be focused on supportive service requirements.
All right, I think I'm taking over from here. Thank you, Shelley. All right, getting into navigating the supportive service requirements. Next slide. Great. So the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, requires supportive services to be offered to youth participating in the FYI initiative to assist youth in achieving that self-sufficiency, right? As Shelley mentioned earlier, it's the LDSS's responsibility to provide or secure really being that key word, a commitment of supportive services for youth for at least 36 months. The supportive services that must be offered are basic life skills information or counseling on money management, use of credit, housekeeping, proper nutrition preparation and access to healthcare, counseling on compliance with rental lease requirements, as well as with HCV program participant requirements, provision of information and assurances to owners on the private market to assist eligible youth in obtaining housing, job preparation counseling, so things like where to look or how to apply for a job or how to dress for success, at your job, other soft skills, things like that. And then also educational and career advancement counseling, so things like how to get your GED, college degree, or trade certification. And just a reminder to everyone, when you're applying, HUD provides information on their website on what supportive services need to be required. Just make sure you're checking either the competitive application to ensure you're providing all the required supportive service requirements, or check that PHAs notice related to the non-competitive program to make sure you're still in compliance with the supportive services that are required as part of that program as well. Next slide, please. So as I was talking about on the previous slide, LDSSs really have that responsibility to provide or secure those supportive services to FYI eligible youth. There is, unfortunately, no additional funding that comes with the FYI program to provide those supportive services. So with that said, LDSSs, y'all have to get creative, right? You can provide supportive services in a number of ways, utilizing a variety of partners, including those that you see listed here on the screen. For example, if a public housing authority that you're partnering with has a family self-sufficiency program that provides educational counseling, they can ensure that the youth is enrolled in that family self-sufficiency program, which is a HUD requirement, by the way, and that program would satisfy the educational counseling supportive service requirement. LDSS can also partner with local continuums of care to identify and secure supportive services. Really, the partnership for supportive services is fluid and really just largely depends on what supportive services exist and what works best, right, within your locality. The partnership agreement, either a memorandum of understanding or letter of intent, has to document who is providing the supportive services required by HUD and what those supportive services entail. Supportive services partners can provide additional services beyond HUD requirements, and those services and partners don't have to be documented in the partnership agreement, although I will say I think it's a best practice to be helpful to lay out the responsibilities and provide those additional supportive services, who's handling them, what they are in that partnership agreement as well. For example, we spoke with some agencies that really go above and beyond and provide sort of full-scale housing search assistance for the non-competitive program. So they're taking the youth to view the apartment and offering other supports that are really helpful in making sure that the partnership is the most effective. I really just want to drive home here, right, that we really encourage LDSS agencies to get creative, collaborate with your public housing authority to identify any supportive services that they may provide or refer their youth to, and leverage your networks to see where you can offload responsibility and cost while really providing the best possible support to your youth to get them housed and keep them housed. Next slide. So continuing along that train of thought, if an LDS agency doesn't have the funding and the cards to provide those supportive services, like I said, it's important to leverage any free resources or nonprofits that tend to be philanthropic based or self-supported and are already providing these services. And for the purpose of the training, we're just saying supportive service partners. HUD is going to call them those third-party agencies. So you can leverage multiple supportive service partners. It doesn't have to be just one to provide those supportive services. Use your network. I know I already said this, but ensure the supportive services are identified and listed in that memorandum of understanding. In the next two slides that you're going to see up here really provide some resources to tap into when you're beginning to identify your supportive service partners. I won't read through all of them, but we'll call out a few. So, if you're looking to provide that credit counseling, right? Look to your credit union, see if they're already offering any sort of money management classes that you can leverage. Use your faith-based community or nonprofit community to see if they operate any job preparation classes. You can keep going to the next slide. Really just partner with other government or state agencies, such as the Department of Education or your local community college, right, to identify any low-cost educational opportunities. You can see there are plenty of resources that you can look into and build connections with and partnerships with that you can even leverage outside of this FYI program to provide supportive services to those individuals that you're serving. And like I said, these slides will be distributed. So you can click on the links that we have here in the screen that can be used as a reference or starting point on where you can begin to seek out or really identify those supportive service agencies that are in your area. I know that was quick, but like I said, really important. Use this as a starting block. Be creative. Leverage what's already in your community. And with that said, we'll move into our next set of poll questions. The link is in the chat, but the first is going to be, right, our supportive services are only required for competitive FYI. Is that true or false? It's fun to watch all these answers come in real time, I will say. And it looks like folks are on the right path here. Exactly, I know we're still filtering in, but I think we have a good bunch of folks that have already answered that is correct. It's going to be false. Supportive services are required for both competitive and non-competitive FYI. Heading into the next poll question, it's another true or false, right? All required supportive services must be provided by one organization. Is that true or false? I'll let people begin to answer. Always good to see everyone all on the same page, and that means that I have done my job. So that is correct. That is also false. They can be provided by more than one agency. Again, use all those supports that you have in your area. All right. We will get into updating your administrative plan. So just a little bit of background. I know when we were completing the FYI assessment months ago, we heard that there was some confusion regarding the Public Housing Authority's requirement to update their admin plan. So we're going to get into that in the next few slides, starting with what is an administrative plan. An administrative plan, otherwise referred to often as an admin plan, is a publicly available document that outlines the written policies that govern a public housing authority's housing choice voucher program and other special voucher programs like foster youth independence program. Public housing authorities are required to update their admin plan to include information about the FYI program administration prior to applying for and receiving FYI vouchers. Really prior to administering the program, but we want you to do it first thing. We want you to do it right prior to applying as a best practice so that you can, after you make the decision to apply, after you apply, you're not going to be held up from actually administering the vouchers or being at risk of being non-compliant with HUD. So updating the admin plan can be a long process. It has to go through a public comment period and board approval. And because of that, public housing authorities don't typically update their plans each year. Make sure you get this on the Public Housing Authority's radar, your public housing authority. Make sure this is on your radar and get it updated as soon as you make that decision to administer the program. Next slide. With that said, right, HUD has already recommended some minimum draft language to include in the admin plan regarding the FYI program. It's really short and sweet, and it satisfies HUD's requirements, so recommend that you adopt it as you see fit. Specifically, it outlines that the Public Housing Authority waiting list is continuously open for FYI referrals of eligible youth from LDSS agencies as long as FYI vouchers are available, that applications meeting the requirements of FYI will be accepted by the PHA on a referral basis, provided that there is funding available, and that FYI funding is made available. If it's available, it's going to be made available to those FYI eligible youth, right? Public housing authorities can choose to provide or outline additional language in their admin plans if they were like. Some agencies, want to put more specifics in there, outlining the referral partners. Other likes to keep things broad, really. It's just personal preference. If you keep it broad, there's more room to address program administration if needed, right? So keep that in mind as you are going through this process. And yeah, with that said, make sure everything is updated. Use this lit stop language if it makes the most sense for y'all, and get it on the radar as soon as possible. I think we can head into the next section, and that is prioritizing LDSS referrals. I'm going to quickly touch on another responsibility of the LDSS agencies and the FYI life cycle, and that is developing a system of prioritization for referrals to the Public Housing Authority based on the use level of need and the appropriateness of intervention. Perfect. So what does that mean? Well, LDSS agencies need to determine sort of the priority order to send referrals in to the Public Housing Authority. This process, right, is going to be less important if there aren't a large number of referrals waiting to be submitted. But if there is a large number of referrals and not enough vouchers to get everyone housed, or if there are a lot of youth in unsafe situations, it's really important to have an established prioritization system. Some factors to consider when establishing this system, ideally during program design, when you're drafting that memorandum of understanding or letter of intent, are listed here on the screen. To me, urgency seems really important, right? Identifying and prioritizing youth, considering whether they're currently homeless or living in an unsafe condition versus another youth that may be in stable housing for another 8 to 12 months, and then referring them based on that prioritization. Really, referral prioritization and the reasoning behind it is another process in the FYI lifecycle that should really be shaped by the needs of each LDSS locality, and specifically, the youth needs in those localities. Just ensuring that you are getting people through the process in the way that makes most sense and meets those urgent needs of the youth to keep them housed and keep them sustainably housed. And I think that brings us to the end of this short section. I'm going to toss it back over to Shelly to go through the voucher application process.
Thanks, Jamie. I know we're going through a lot of information here, but now we want to talk through the application process itself. You have your partners, you have your supportive services, and you've updated your administrative plan, and you're prioritizing, your referrals. You've set all of that up. After all of that, that's when you go for your non-competitive versus competitive. As we said, you can apply for earlier in those steps. So how do you decide? You have two options, competitive or non-competitive. We've talked about them a lot. The application processes are different, and we're going to go through each of them now. But something to think about is, the PHA is the one who is submitting that application form or, responding to the NOFO. But often it's the local Department of Social Services who has a better understanding of what the need is for these vouchers. They are able to look at the number of youth who are, transitioning out of the foster care system, or just, look at the data that they have to see what they anticipate the need is for this coming year. And maybe if it's minimal, there are only a few vouchers they anticipate needing, they'll go they may recommend, hey, let's go non-competitive route this year. Or if you just have, so many, you have so much need, you might go the competitive route. So just talking with each other to figure out, what is the need. The supportive service provider can also usually provide some context into, what they're hearing from you around which path to go. The other thing to note is that if you are rejected from the competitive funding, so you respond to the NOFO, you get rejected, you can still apply for the non-competitive voucher. It doesn't, prohibit you from going the non-competitive route after. So just, you can always keep your option open, and you can apply for non-competitive vouchers multiple times per year. It's not, just one time. When it comes to the competitive funding, you can only respond once to one NOFO. Let's think about this in practice and what this would look like. So here we have a scenario where we have a PHA that decides to utilize non-competitive vouchers. They say, okay, we're starting our program. I think it makes sense to just, go that route to begin with. Once they start, the initiative, they realize that there's just a growing need. There's just a great need for these vouchers, and there are a lot of youth that are transitioning out of foster care that are at risk of homelessness and want access to these vouchers. They then decide to apply for competitive funding in response to a NOFO so that they can get a larger number of vouchers. If they do get these vouchers, they still keep the non-competitive vouchers that they've had before. So they just get these on top of the non-competitive vouchers. It doesn't take away their non-competitive vouchers. So they then just have competitive and non-competitive vouchers. They can administer both at the same time. A benefit of going this route for this PHA is that they have a lot of need. So with competitive funding, they now have, let's say they get all 75 vouchers. They have that allotment. They have the funding already. So when the youth come to them and say, hey, we want a voucher, or they get referred to the PHA rather, they can say, okay, we already have the funding, and it's usually a quicker turnaround to getting that voucher into the youth's hand and getting them leased up. So that's something to just note, that there tends to be, you have to put in more to apply for the competitive funding. The application process is more complex. But once you have the vouchers, there is a lower administrative burden to getting those vouchers leased up. Let's talk about non-competitive first. To be eligible to apply for non-competitive vouchers, a PHA must already be administering a housing choice voucher program. It is the PHA that has to apply for these vouchers. We know that there are nonprofits that, administer mainstream vouchers, mainstream assistance. They're not eligible to administer FYI. It has to be a PHA. So if you're a PHA administering an HCV program, then you can think about, okay, do I meet the next requirement, which is a threshold requirement. So if you are a PHA already administering FYI or FUP, the Family Unification Program, HUD will look at your utilization, what is utilization? Utilization is the number of vouchers that are leased up with a HAP contract. So let's say you're a PHA that only administers FUP at this time. If you have 10 or less vouchers, existing vouchers, they'll see if you've utilized 50% of them. If you have 11 or more, they'll look to see if you've utilized 90% of them. If you have both FUP and FYI, they'll look at the total numbers. So the combination of FUP and FYI vouchers that you're currently administering, and if you meet those utilization requirements. There is a way to get an exception to this utilization criteria. You do have to submit basically a narrative saying this is why we're not reaching the utilization requirement, and HUD can say whether they find that reasonable or not. Okay, so once you determine that you're hitting the requirements, you have an HCV program, and you're meeting the threshold requirements, you can apply for an initial maximum of 25 non-competitive vouchers. So what does that mean, an initial maximum? So let's say it's the beginning of the federal fiscal year, so it's October, and you have 35 pre-identified youth that want these vouchers. Unfortunately, at that time, you can only request 25 vouchers when you're initially requesting them. Let's think about another scenario. Let's say it's October and you have 10 youth identified. And then in January, you identify another 10 youth. You can submit another application for those 10 youth in January. You're not restricted to only applying one time per year. You can even apply for another 5 in February, or so on and so forth. Once you hit that maximum, 25 initial allotment. So let's say, back to our first scenario where you requested those 25 in the beginning of October, you can request an additional 25. The requirement here, again, is a utilization requirement. So 90% of your vouchers have to be leased up in order to apply for those additional 25. And then you cap out at 50. So you can't get more than 50 non-competitive vouchers each year. So let's look at a scenario here. So although you can only get, you max out at that 50 non-competitive vouchers each year, previous year vouchers roll over. So let's look at this visual on the bottom here. You have, in year 1, you get 5 non-competitive vouchers. The next year, those 5 non-competitive vouchers do not count towards your 50 annual maximum, right? And the next year, the 10 vouchers from year 2, from the bucket before, and 5 vouchers from the first year, so a total of 15 vouchers that you've had from the previous 2 years, those don't count towards your annual maximum either. So your vouchers can build up over time. The next question you might ask is, okay, what happens to those 5 initial vouchers from the first year after the youth finish up with their voucher, right? So after 5 years, let's say they got that extension and they were in the initiative for 5 years, but now they're no longer, eligible to continue to use the voucher. So those, 5 youth, those vouchers, if the PHA has pre-identified youth, for example, there are youth on the waiting list, they can give those vouchers to those youth. So they can easily just transfer the voucher to another youth. However, if there are no identified youth, then the PHA must notify HUD and HUD will recoup the voucher. So that's, how the non-competitive vouchers work over time, and the, number of vouchers that you can get each year. So now let's talk about, actually requesting those vouchers. So the PHA is the one who has to fill out the form itself. And it's, it's just like a Microsoft form that asks you for different information. So it asks you about the partners. It'll make you certify that you have a partnership agreement. It does not make you upload that partnership agreement, which is different than the competitive application. You just have to say that you have one. It'll ask about, your FYI and FUP vouchers and your utilization if you are administering those vouchers. And then a key point of the non-competitive application is identifying those youth, right? You have to identify the youth prior to submitting this application. So you have to write down, who those youth are that you're requesting vouchers for. And then the last thing is the certification of HUD 52515. This is just a general grant application form. If you're a PHA, you may be familiar with this if you applied for grants in the past. Just something to note is that it has to be signed by someone, of an executive level at the PHA. Depending on your PHA, it varies who exactly can sign it, but just keep that in mind when you're, you may go through this application and you're like, oh, now I need to do this form. It might take some time because we need someone else to sign it. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're filling out the form, that maybe prioritize doing, the last thing in the application form in the beginning and getting through that faster. So just keeping that in mind. Okay, now that we've talked about the non-competitive process, I'm going to talk about the competitive process, right? So the competitive process is different in that you need to respond to a NOFO, a Notice of Funding Opportunity from HUD. So you can look at their FYI voucher landing page, just, to see if there are any NOFOs out, things like that. They also release updates and notices, so just kind of a good resource for you all to have there. And, as a reminder, it is competitive. So when you are doing your application process, you do want to think about how to make it the most comprehensive as possible and the most accurate, right? So one thing that you can do is go to the HUD FYI FAQs. There are a lot of questions, a lot of answers, and that can help you make sure that you are creating a comprehensive application. Okay, wanted to go over this FAQ that, we noticed a bunch of people were asking, which is a PHA responds to a NOFO in 2025 and is allocated 20 competitive vouchers. Can the PHA respond to the 2026 NOFO and request additional vouchers? The answer is yes. Because you applied in 2025 does not disqualify you from applying in 2026. You can respond to the new NOFO and get additional vouchers. The one thing to note is that you don't automatically get anything in the 2026 NOFO just because you got vouchers in 2025. So you're not going to automatically get another 20 vouchers in 2026 because you got 20 in 2025. That's going to kind of vary depending on your current situation and your application, but you do have the ability to apply. It just depends on your 2026 application. Okay, so as we mentioned before, another thing about the competitive FYI process is that you are required to have an MOU, which has additional requirements. We talked through this earlier in the establishing partnership agreement section, so I'm not going to go into that. You can always go back and revisit that. But wanted to talk about this if you are applying to competitive funding over time. So let's say with our previous example, let's say you responded to the NOFO in 2025. So you already have a memorandum of understanding from that application process. Now it's, maybe it's 2026, you want to apply to that NOFO. If the requirements are the same in that NOFO, it says, you need an MOU with the same things that was the same requirements as the previous year, you can use that same MOU. You just have to certify that it's active and it's still in effect. So something to keep in mind that you can use a previous MOU, you just have to certify that it's active. Okay, another piece of the competitive FYI application is the rating factor certification. So the rating factor certification is a rubric. It basically says it asks a bunch of questions. It's actually pretty long. And this is how you're determined if you get, if you get points. So it's the application, you can respond to questions yes or no, and based off of your responses, you can get up to 100 points. So it's a 100-point scale. You need at least 61 points to even be considered for funding. But it's not, it is partially yes, no responses to questions. For example, have you updated your administrative plan and included the requirements, right? It could be yes. The answer is yes, but in order to receive your points, in addition to saying yes, you have to say, and this is where you can find that information on this page. So you have to direct them to the exact place where they can find that information. You can't just respond yes or no. This rating factor certification has a bunch of explanation at the end as well about each section and how many points each section is worth and the maximum points that you can get. So if you look at the rating factor certification, you can just Google it and take a look at it. You can kind of see the different sections if you want to explore the different points and how you can get that. The other thing I wanted to note is that it is a long form. It does request a lot of information. So it also is helpful to work with your partners on filling this out. Specifically, your local Department of Social Services can probably provide additional context as well. So the competitive application, it has a lot of forms and attachments. We talked about the memorandum of understanding. I just spoke about the rating factor certification. So those are the two attachments. In addition to that, you have a bunch of required forms. These required forms, if you're a PHA and you apply for grant funding, they may be familiar to you. They are just general forms that you have to fill out when you're applying for grant funding from HUD. The one unique form here is that statement of needs. So the statement of needs attachment basically asks you how many competitive vouchers you anticipate needing in the next 12 months. And then it asks you to break it down by eligible youth who are in foster care currently and eligible youth who have already left foster care. So that's just an additional form that you have to include in the application as well. So I know that was a lot of information. Hopefully it was helpful. That is, where we're going to be wrapping up this section of, the non-competitive and competitive voucher application processes. They are a little different, but hopefully we've shed some light on kind of the different processes and how to go about choosing between the two. So we'll now move into another mentee poll question, which is, which of the following are true of non-competitive vouchers? So if we can go ahead and pull that one up. Okay, let's see if we get some answers coming in. Okay, so we have a few options here. Which of the following are true of non-competitive vouchers? Youth must be identified prior to applying. There is no limit on the number of vouchers one can apply for. PHAs can apply with a letter of intent or MOU. PHAs must apply in response to a NOFO. Okay, it looks like we have some more trickling in, but looks like we're going in the right direction. There are multiple true statements here. Let's give you a little hint there. But I will say no one said there's no limit. That's correct. There is a limit. The initial limit is 25 in that beginning of year, and then the annual year, the federal fiscal year, you're capped at 50. PHAs do not need to respond to a NOFO for non-competitive. That is competitive vouchers. PHAs submit the request form for non-competitive vouchers. And it is true that youth must be identified prior to applying to the non-competitive voucher. That's part of the application form to insert the names of the youth. And then you can apply with a letter of intent or an MOU for non-competitive. So looks like we're in the right direction here as well. Okay, I'm now going to pass it off to Atticus to talk about the FYI life cycle and best practices.
Okay, hello? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Atticus, and I'm going to be talking about the FYI lifecycle and best practices. Before we get into that, we are a little more than halfway through. So if everyone could just do a little impromptu poll for me, if you could drop an emoji in the chat that reflects how you feel about the training so far, we could just take a quick peek at that. I'll go first. big old smiley face. And if you feel the inclination to put an emoji that shows us that you're feeling a bit unsure about the content, also feel free to use the chat to drop any questions you might have. We are monitoring, and we will be responding to questions we can answer in the moment. And if we can't answer your question in the moment, we will take that question and answer it on the back end. So moving on. Oh, I'm seeing lots of lots of emojis. I love seeing how everyone's feeling about the training. Hopefully I can continue with that positive impression that most of us have. So here's an overview of the FYI lifecycle. If you participated in our 101 series, we went into the granular details behind the cycle of connecting youth with a voucher. We're going to do a bit of a higher level scan of this process and go into best practices, but we did want to talk about the overall life cycle. So we have 3 phases captured here, but before any of these phases, we have to establish a program as we discussed and identify eligible youth. So establishing a program is encapsulates incorporating FYI vouchers into a public housing authority's administrative plan, or also encapsulates starting that partnership agreement. So just establishing the program, and once that program is established, identifying eligible youth. This can be done by third-party supportive service providers, or it can be done by the local Department of Social Services, or it can be done by the Public Housing Authority. Ultimately, anyone can identify an eligible youth, but the local Department of Social Services in the partnership agreement must be the one to certify the youth's eligibility and refer them to the Public Housing Authority. Just wanted to note that. So that leads us into phase 1, referral coordination. This is where the local Department of Social Services will certify the youth's eligibility and refer them to the Public Housing Authority. And the eligibility they are certifying in this case is the youth's eligibility for the FYI program. Once they're referred to the Public Housing Authority is the one who undertakes waiting list administration. So this is where the youth will apply to the Housing Choice Voucher waiting list as an FYI youth. The Public Housing Authority is the one who will maintain that waitlist and eventually will pull the youth off of the waitlist for screening. The youth will then undergo another eligibility review. This time, eligibility review is based on the criteria of the Public Housing Authority. So this is internal eligibility that is laid out in the administrative plan. So you can definitely use the administrative plan as a resource to help prepare the youth for the eligibility screening that they will undergo with the Public Housing Authority. So once this phase 1 referral coordination has been done, we move into phase 2, which is the housing search. So once a youth has been determined to be eligible based on the PHA's requirements, they will attend a voucher briefing at the PHA. After this voucher briefing, they will be issued a voucher and given instruction on going into the rental market and finding a unit. So this is really where the youth really steps up in this process and takes control of their autonomy over their housing as they search for a unit. Once they've found a unit that they like and they apply for, they can submit a request for tenancy approval. This document just initiates the process between the landlord, the youth, and the Public Housing Authority to get the unit leased up. And once this request for tenancy approval is submitted, the Public Housing Authority will initiate an inspection and a rent offer with the private landlord. And then once the inspection and rent offer have been made, the landlord and the Public Housing Authority will enter into a HAP contract, or a housing assistance payment contract. And this is between the landlord and the Public Housing Authority to establish the amount of subsidy that will be paid on behalf of the youth. And throughout this process, the local Department of Social Services is responsible for providing or securing up to 36 months of supportive services for the youth. And the voucher lasts for these 36 months, but there is an option to extend for another 24. So that is a very high level overview of the steps in the FYI lifecycle. But we wanted to kind of go into a best practice view of this these steps, which is on the next slide. So the first best practice we have is for preparing a referral. And the way we broke out these best practices is we took a challenge that we heard from stakeholders in these processes, and we kind of just extrapolated out of that challenge some best practices that we saw from different agencies, different stakeholders that we interviewed, to help give you some guidance on things that are maybe not required by HUD, not required by the FYI program, but can help really facilitate the success of implementing a program and the success of your youth. So the first challenge that we identified in preparing referrals is that the process is complex, and this may discourage youth who want to apply. So some of the best practices we found for the local Department of Social Services to take up is to set up introductory meetings with identified youth and walk them through the process and explain the documentation required. So this is before the LDSS even refers the youth to the Public Housing Authority. Having these introductory meetings with the youth can be a great way to identify their eligibility, but also identify their interest. You know, if the youth isn't interested in this program, then you may want to focus your efforts on a youth who is more engaged and interested, and helping introduce them to this program can really help them throughout this process, help the success as they matriculate through the FYI voucher process. At the end of the introductory meeting, we also recommend that the local Department of Social Services schedules a follow-up meeting with the youth and requests that they bring required documentation. So this required documentation would be the documentation required by the Public Housing Authority during eligibility screening. So this follow-up meeting can be a great way of setting expectations with the youth of here's what you will need when you do your eligibility screening with the Public Housing Authority, and it can help prepare them for that process. And finally, we also recommend that as a best practice, the local Department of Social Services begins preparing the referral as soon as possible. Prepare the referral early so it can be submitted exactly 180 days before the youth transitions out of foster care. Now, obviously, this is an ideal, not a requirement. The youth can have already transitioned out of foster care and still be eligible for an FYI voucher, but it's our recommendation that if you have a youth that you know will be transitioning out, say within the year they're 17 and they're going to turn 18 next year and transition out, you can start preparing their referral even before that 180 days, so that by the time that time period comes, you can have it submitted to the Public Housing Authority and initiate the process as soon as possible. So those are some best practices we have for kind of demystifying the process and centering the youth's experience in the application. Another challenge we heard in preparing referrals is that credit scores are required to rent a unit, and many youth are not, don't have, they have substandard credit or they don't have any credit. So in the preparing of a referral, we recommend that supportive service providers and local departments of social services encourage youth to get a pre-credit report. This can be really helpful because it can show the youth kind of where they stand with credit. So that's helpful when they go into the private market and try to identify a unit, because some landlords have very specific credit requirements. This can also help the youth flag any discrepancies with their credit report, which may be fraudulent or they may need to address. And we discuss that more on the next slide. So continuing on with the pre-credit report, just some additional information there. Young adults who are 18 to 21 and are currently in foster care or have transitioned out of foster care can obtain their credit report by accessing the following link, annualcreditreport.com. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires each nationwide credit reporting agency, and that's going to be like Equifax, or I'm drawing a blank, but they're like the other two that I'm sure everyone knows. It requires those credit reporting agencies to provide adults with a free copy of their credit report once every 12 months. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the credit reporting agencies actually relaxed the once per year restriction, such that individuals may now obtain copies of their credit reports up to once per week. And if fraudulent credit history exists or there's a credit error discovered, the local Department of Social Services or supportive service providers can assist the youth with contacting the credit agency to have the information corrected, or writing the letter to the credit reporting agency to request some sort of appeal. So this is why, when preparing a referral, this pre-credit check before the youth is put in front of an eligibility screening at the housing authority or goes into the private rental market can be so instrumental in preparing them for that next process. So continuing on, best practices for submitting a referral to the Public Housing Authority. The local Department of Social Services is responsible for verifying that the youth meets the following FYI requirements. I'm sure we already referenced these in the beginning of this training, but the three base level requirements are that the youth is within an eligible age range between the age of 18 to 24 years old. They have transitioned out of or are transitioning out of foster care within the next 180 days and are at risk of homelessness. Following the verification of eligibility, the local Department of Social Services can refer the youth to the Public Housing Authority by emailing the Public Housing Authority the following information: the youth's name and date of birth, right? So basic information about the youth, a confirmation of foster care history and exit timeline. So this hits on that second point about them transitioning out within the next 180 days or having already transitioned out. So when the local Department of Social Service makes this referral, they have to send confirmation of the foster care history and exit timeline. And finally, a statement of housing instability or risk of homelessness. This is just a certification that the youth is at risk of homelessness or is currently homeless, and that is why they are in need of this FYI voucher. And then the last point just reiterates what I have mentioned before. The Public Housing Authority will complete their own eligibility checks. It's almost like a pre-eligibility that the local Department of Social Services is providing. They are certifying that the youth is eligible for the Foster Youth to Independence program, whereas later the Public Housing Authority will be the one to certify that the youth is eligible for the Housing Choice Voucher program in general. So continuing on with our best practices for referral and application coordination, another challenge that was identified when we interviewed stakeholders is that the number of youth referred may be greater than the number of vouchers available. The best practice that we have for housing authorities in this situation is to utilize the Foster Youth to Independence and Family Unification Program vouchers strategically to increase the number of vouchers available. There is a Venn diagram where the FYI and FUP vouchers overlap, but FUP vouchers are more broad and can address other populations other than just foster youth. So a public housing authority might want to strategize based on the different populations of families or foster youth they have on how they want to use either the FYI or FUP vouchers. And you could get even more granular with competitive versus non-competitive. There are situations where some housing authorities might find it more beneficial or more strategic to use one type of voucher over another based on the population that they have. So our recommendation would be to really dig into the FUP and FYI programs, specifically the non-competitive and competitive FYI, to see what would best serve the population that your jurisdiction has. Another challenge that we identified is that youth may have difficulty securing and providing a public housing authority with required application documentation. So a best practice that local departments of social services and the supportive service provider could take is to help the youth complete the PHA application materials. These stakeholders can provide support to the youth in collecting key certification documents like birth certificate or ID prior to submitting the referral. So this goes back to that first slide where we talked about setting up that second meeting with the youth and requesting that they bring their documentation that might be needed for eligibility screening with the Public Housing Authority. If you have the youth collect this documentation in advance and also work with the youth to identify documentation that they don't have that they need to gain access to. If you do that before you even refer them out to the Public Housing Authority, it can greatly expedite the screening timeline and help facilitate the youth's matriculation through this process. So that is one best practice to engage in before the referral. And all stakeholders, whether it's the local Department of Social Services, the Public Housing Authority, or the supportive service providers, as a best practice, should establish routine check-ins among the foster youth to independent administrators to discuss referral status and escalated cases. What does this mean? Essentially, if your organization, whether it be the Public Housing Authority or local Department of Social Services, has a point of contact for the foster youth to independence program, it is advisable that these point persons at these different agencies have these routine meetings where they can come together and discuss how the program is being implemented. The local Department of Social Services can identify, hey, here are some pain points we were having in the referral process, or connecting the youth with supportive services. The Public Housing Authority could say, these are pain points we were having with the referral process, and all the stakeholders can come together to identify ways that they can incorporate the best practices we have here, or they can incorporate best practices that we haven't even identified yet. So establishing that routine check-in is really a major way to facilitate the implementation of this program. So here we have a quote from a young adult recipient of the FYI voucher in Virginia, which is as follows. Getting the FYI voucher was incredibly difficult and stressful. It was nearly impossible to get in touch with the housing authority, and I spent weeks not knowing if I'd have a place to live. I didn't even find out I was approved for my apartment until just 2 days before aging out of care. The process was confusing, and no one seemed to have all the answers I needed. I felt alone and overwhelmed, trying to figure it all out on my own. It shouldn't be that hard to get support that's meant to help us transition successfully. So this is a really powerful quote that really touches to the heart of these best practices, in that these are not required pieces of this program, of implementing this program, but they are really essential and critical pieces to facilitating the success of youth and the ease of their transition into this alternative housing outside of foster care. This really just goes to show that incorporating these best practices, not only can help you as a service provider or housing authority staff to implement this program, but also can help the youth who are at the center of this whole process. So continuing on with our best practices, we move into the housing search. A challenge we identified is that youth are required to undergo a process they have not experienced. What process is that? Well, it's not just the foster youth to independent process, it's the housing search process. I liken it to my first time entering the rental market was as a student at a university, right? So that is kind of in and of itself a learning lesson for university students of how it feels to identify a place you want to live. If you meet the requirements, if you're a university student, there's housing for athletes, there's housing for honors kids. It kind of teaches you the ropes of like a rental market through the lens of like a school situation. So in this case, the foster youth don't have that opportunity in that specific situation, and have never undergone like the housing search process before. So one best practice we recommend is that supportive service providers accompany the youth to the FYI briefing in order to provide support and additional explanation as needed. So the housing authority will do the briefing, but having that supportive service provider there with the youth can be really instrumental in helping fill in some of the gaps for them on the process overall. And all the stakeholders can designate housing navigators to support youth with the housing search. This goes for the Department of Social Services, the public housing authorities, and the supportive service providers. Having designated housing navigators that can facilitate the youth's housing search can be really instrumental in connecting the youth with housing when they are assigned their voucher. Another challenge we identified is the limited affordable housing in Virginia. So something that the public housing authorities can do as a best practice is maintain a list of affordable housing complexes to share with youth when they begin their search for a unit. So this can be a really great way to have like a baseline of where youth can start their search at least. We also have found that landlords may be hesitant to lease to youth with a voucher, maybe because they have substandard credit or they don't have a rental history. So conducting landlord outreach to pre-established relationships can be very helpful. We heard this with our Virginia Beach case study, that they had a group of landlords that they had a working relationship with, that had trust with the program administrators and were more likely to bring the youth into their rental complex as a result of that. So one way this is done was at a meeting with landlords, inviting the local Department of Social Services and any partners who would present at the meeting and address the landlord's questions. This is just a great way to build trust and build a repertoire of landlords who are more likely to accept the youth. And this just identifies landlords who are more amenable to accepting lower or substandard credit, or maybe someone without a leasing history like a foster youth in this program. And finally, we could also increase access to housing options through project basing the FYI voucher without additional approval from HUD. So public housing authorities can provide an FYI voucher as a tenant-based voucher, which we have discussed, or a project-based voucher, also known as PBV assistance. So project-based FYI vouchers are committed to specific units within specific housing developments to serve eligible households to move into that unit. So basically what the project-based vouchers do is they create long-term affordability by committing rental assistance to a specific property for an initial term of 1 to 20 years with the opportunity for extensions. So essentially why project basing can be such a valuable resource is that it specifically ties the foster youth to independent voucher to a specific unit. So it's basically like that unit is on reserve for the FYI voucher, instead of the youth being attached to the voucher and having to go into the private market and find a landlord who accepts the voucher. So this is definitely something we recommend that housing authorities look into to gauge interest, especially if they have an existing population of youth who would use the FYI voucher. Finally, looks like we're coming to the end of my section. Another best practice as far as lease ups, the challenge that we found is that youth lack adequate resources to set up their apartment. So we recommend that supportive service providers leverage community organizations to assist the youth through the process. And this could look like down payment deposit assistance, or some charities help the youth furnish their apartment. Some philanthropic organizations I know also like donate things like window ACs or appliances. So connecting youth with this can be really helpful in not only getting them housing, but helping them set up a house that is habitable. Another challenge we found is that youth are not familiar with key leasing practices. Again, this goes back to what we discussed previously, that they've never undergone a process like this before. So the local Department of Social Services and the supportive service providers can help the youth by setting up reminders like alarms or calendar invites to pay their rent, or perform other key leasing functions like maintaining unit cleanliness, or if you live somewhere where it snows, which it does snow sometimes in Virginia, sometimes tenants are responsible for scraping snow. So these stakeholders can help the youth maintain that cadence of being a responsible tenant who meets the needs of their tenancy. And then we have a best practice for continued occupancy. So The Fostering Stable Housing Opportunity Amendments of 2020 provide a 24-month extension of the FYI voucher assistance. In order to be eligible for this extension, the youth must be enrolled in a public housing authority's Family Self-Sufficiency Program, also known as FSS, or be engaged in education, workforce development, or employment activities for at least 9 of the 12 preceding months prior to the extension. So this is a resource available to the youth in case they do need an extension from that 36 initial months. They can get a 2-year extension as long as they are qualified by being enrolled in these activities. Another challenge we identified is that transitions can be extra challenging for this demographic. We have found that as a best practice, housing authorities can maintain consistency and ease the transition for the youth by allocating continued occupancy and fostering stable housing opportunities, responsibilities to the same staff responsible for foster youth independence administration. Essentially, this is just a long-winded way of saying if you make one person the point of contact and that youth continues to have one person at the housing authority that's maintains a working relationship with them, it can be easier for the youth who is already undergoing a lot of transitions to have one point of contact and be able to build a relationship with a certain key contact at the housing authority who manages this program. We've also found as a best practice that housing authorities can establish general HCV voucher preferences for youth losing access, or their, in essence, the time limit is up to the FYI voucher by documenting it in the administrative plan. So if your housing authority identifies this, where you have youth who reach the end of their foster youth to independence voucher, you could amend your administrative plan to give them preferential treatment on a wait list for a traditional voucher to help them transition further. So finally, we have a frequently asked question, which has come up quite a bit. How can I support a youth who is in the custody of my local Department of Social Services, but wants to live in another locality, right? Because a lot of the Foster Youth to Independence program and social services for foster youth is very jurisdictionally based. But what happens when a youth, reaches the age of 18 and may want to live in a different jurisdiction? We recommend contacting the public housing authority in the locality where the youth wants to live to see if they have FYI vouchers available. Just as a note, public housing authorities cannot apply a residency preference to FUP or FYI applicants. We do want to highlight this because public housing authorities can apply a residency preference for their general traditional housing choice vouchers or other programs. But as far as the FYI and FUP goes, public housing authorities specifically cannot apply a residency preference for these applicants. And if the PHA is in the locality where the youth wants to live, if they do not have FYI vouchers and the PHA in the locality where the youth currently lives has a voucher, the youth can access the FYI voucher where they currently live and port it. This is an official term, port it to the other locality in accordance with the administering public housing authority's portability guidelines. This is referred to as voucher portability. This is something that voucher holders in the traditional housing choice voucher program have a right to do or have the capacity to do. So that is the same for the FYI vouchers. Public housing authorities may not restrict or deny portability for an FYI participant for reasons other than those specified in HCV program regulations. And porting a voucher may disconnect a youth from supportive services, but it is ultimately up to that youth to decide if that is the route that they want to take. Again, we want to center the youth's autonomy and their right to choose their circumstance. So if they find that it would serve them better to live in a different jurisdiction and be disconnected from the supportive services of their current jurisdiction, that is within their right. And
Over to me. Yeah, I'm
Shelly.
gonna
Okay.
wrap up,
Thank you.
our section talking about increasing awareness of FYI. So, we talked about establishing these initiatives. So now thinking about how do we make people aware that, we're doing this. So a few things that you can do as a local Department of Social Services, thinking about the youth who are transitioning out of foster care. You know who those youth are. You know who are turning 18 or turning 21 if they're in fostering futures in the coming year, and who may be eligible. So begin outreach to those youth. Another way to reach youth specifically is, and this is something both the LDSS and the supportive services provider can do as well, is connecting eligible youth. So, those youth who you think that may want to utilize the voucher with youth who have already utilized the voucher, who are either like leased up or have used it in the past. And so that they can have a personal connection and hear from someone who's gone through the experience, what it's like. And that can help create awareness as well. So having those kind of like youth ambassadors, the youth who are already utilizing the voucher. In addition to that, all partners can host informational sessions. You can host informational sessions for youth. PHAs, you can host informational sessions for landlords, supportive service providers. You can host informational sessions for your own staff, and you can all do the things that I've said for each other, right? Each of your organizations, you may want people who are working within the organization to understand that you're starting this initiative. And so that everyone can kind of spread the word. And another note that you could hear is that, sharing information on social media, use your channels to really release that information. VDSS will be sharing a flyer with the training recordings and slides after this. That flyer is really geared towards you all, LDSS, PHAs, and support service providers. So, if you want to create something that's specifically for engaging youth, you use what you have to spread the word on social media. And then the last thing is specifically for LDSSs, thinking about the caseworkers who are working with these youth who are transitioning out of foster care, and letting them, know about this initiative, but informing them about how it works. Maybe taking this training, like how they can serve as a resource for youth throughout this process. And this is, a really strong one to engaging youth as well. So that really wraps up our increasing awareness section, and we're going to move into our closing and Q&A. We'll hear from the VDSS team in just a moment, but if you want to start thinking about your questions and dropping them in the chat, we can start compiling those to answer in just a moment.
Yes, thank you, Shelley. We learned from youth, local departments of social services, our statewide FYI work group, and Guidehouse that youth are often restricted to applying for FYI vouchers only within the locality they have custody prior to the youth exiting foster care due to limitations in the PHA jurisdiction and administrative structure. This decentralized process hinders our young people who relocated for educational, familiar, or employment opportunities outside the originating locality. However, one recommendation that came out of the stakeholders was to centralize this process through a MOU with the state. And I am happy to report that VDSS has received permission to enter an MOU with Virginia Housing and Public Housing Authorities in an effort to centralize it and ensure our youth in Virginia have access to FYI vouchers. Having a statewide MOU will address the pressing needs to support you transitioning from foster care to secure housing services. VDSS propose a more coordinated and centralized approach that will allow for expanded access and better alignment between child welfare and housing services. Now, this MOU will be on a voluntary basis. This is the first time we are doing this, and we're working on this, so be patient with us. But we need you. We need your cooperation to make this happen. But we're also up to the challenge. Again, we need your support. So I just wanted to let you know that we are very excited about this opportunity because we think that would help make the FYI more accessible to our young people wherever they want to live. Now I'll turn it over to Gwen.
Oh, thank you, Letha. And you may not be able to see me, but hopefully you can hear me, or you are able to see me. Thank you. Just wanted to give a huge shout out to our current FYI work group that has helped, propel and evolve this work as we continue to work on it. Here are some of our sub work group leaders who we are especially appreciative of and thankful for. That's the work they do outside of their own jobs. And as you can see here, this, is very Commonwealth strong. It's a myriad of different Virginia agencies and organizations who are coming together to just really improve the implementation and utilization of this program. So again, huge shout out to the people on the screen. And for those not listed, know that you are also incredibly valued and we are so appreciative of you. If you have any interest in joining our FYI work group, please feel free to reach out to me, which I can send my information later. And also there is a survey coming up where you can also indicate if you're interested in me reaching out to you and seeing if you want to join our work group. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. And we'll now drop a survey in the chat. If you can fill that out and fill out your information, it'll be super helpful for us to just get a sense of what you want to join and be involved in and get some feedback on the training and how it went. And so we'll drop that in the chat right now, and then we'll be moving into Q&A. So I will pass it to Jamie to walk through our questions.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to first begin by reviewing the questions that were in the chat and then continue to put questions in the chat. We'll answer them as they come in. We'll also review some common questions that we've heard and that we heard during the FYI 101 training. So the first question that we had today was, do youth have the option to use either voucher, FYI, or FUP? And there's more information about the specific question in FYI 101. But to answer that question, FYI is a program that's targeting youth that meet the 3 criteria that we discussed, right? 18 to 24, transitioning out of foster care in 180 days, and at risk of homelessness. FUP has 2 different populations that they serve under the Family Unification Program. One is called FUP F, that's FUP family. So that's families that meet the criteria. And then there's also what's called FUP Y, FUP youth. That has the similar threshold criteria as the FYI program, exact same, right? So you can serve the eligible youth population of FYI under FUP, the Family Unification Program. You can double up on those programs if you have lots of youth that need access to the program. You can apply for both FUP and FYI if you meet the eligibility criteria to do so. So yes, youth can utilize both programs if you have the need. Another question was, if you have youth turning 21 and want to move out of state, are they able to take that voucher out of state? I know Atticus just covered this, but just to reiterate, the youth could lease up using an FYI and voucher in the locality where they're currently located, and then port or move to that location out of state. And portability, right, it refers to the process which the family can transfer or port their rental subsidy to a location outside the jurisdiction of the public housing agency that first gave them the voucher when they were selected for the program. As Atticus mentioned, PHAs cannot deny portability outside of those that are outlined in HCV regulations. But with that said, housing agencies may have other requirements they have listed in their admin plan. They also have general information about portability in their admin plan. So review that and then take that information back to them, that that they're able to port and that there can't be any additional restrictions on their portability requirements. Yeah. I have a question in the chat about receiving the handout by email. Let VDSS take this one, but I believe we'll be providing the links to the PowerPoint and the webinar in a follow-up. Is that correct, Gwen? Follow-up email?
Yes, absolutely, Jamie. Just as you guys announced earlier, as people may be aware, there's another training on Thursday. So if you missed any part of this, or if you know of other people who may want to attend, please tell them to sign up for that. We're going to be recording both of them and potentially releasing both of them or just one of them with the FYI 101 training and including the PowerPoints as well. Absolutely. Yep, they'll all be shared out.
Awesome. All right, let's see here.
One more item, just
oh.
Jamie, I want to flag that they put that survey in the chat. So if you can go ahead and take a couple of minutes to respond to that, we'll continue to answer questions as they come through. But again, that link is in the chat for you all to respond to.
Exactly. All right. I have a question here. So if a youth ages out, obtains a voucher, the LDSS must provide the supportive services for 3 years. And that is the case if they're enrolled in the FYI program, right, with supportive services, even if they're no longer in extended foster care, they need to be provided, secured and provided for 3 years. Let's see here. The question that continuously came up about whether an MOU that was previously developed for vouchers could be used for FYI. Just wanted to clarify here that unfortunately you would need to execute an MOU that specified it was for use of FYI specifically. So if you enter a MOU for FYI previously and you want to use that under the new allocation of vouchers, that is allowed. But if it's FUP, you do need to enter a new MOU that specifies it is for FYI. See, Monica dropped a question in here. Who are the contacts for youth that age out of foster care at 21? She just noted that youth should connect with an LDSS independent living coordinator point of contact or last worker supervisor of the LDSS that held the custody of the youth. There's also, the possibility that youth are going to be calling around trying to get contacted. So just ensure that people are aware of the FYI program and they can point them in the right direction to their previous LDSS caseworker if needed. Let's see here. Any other common questions that y'all want to call out for me?
None that I saw pop up. One did just come up for VDSS. I think, Letha, it's probably best if you address this. It's when will the statewide MOU be ready for examination?
So we're going through that process now. What we're going to do once we get approval is that our director or commissioner will send out a letter to all of the public housing authorities with a sample MOU, and that should be coming out within the next month. We have a lot of things on our end we would have to take up since this is our first endeavor dealing with this. So it may take a while. I would say several months before we actually have this up and running, but we'll be sure to let you all know.
Yes, we'll keep people updated. And if you join the work group, you might hear about it more often.
Thanks, Gwen.
All right. Again, continue to drop those questions if you have them. Send an email over. We'll get you an answer if we can. And really appreciate everyone taking the time to hop on the training today and get all of your questions answered. And I know you're all going to take back this information and craft some really great FYI programs so we can serve all the youth. So really excited to see.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Robert, yes, copies of the slide and the public YouTube link that can be shared with anybody to these trainings will be sent out as soon as possible, probably early next week, I imagine, as we wrap stuff up and make sure it's all good. But yes, you will get all of these resources here. And please feel free to hang out and ask any other questions. Thank you so much for attending. And as you leave, feel free to give a big thank you and shout out to Guidehouse. We can only continue to express our sincerest gratitude to them to being such great team workers and partners in this process. And we would not be able to do a lot of the stuff we're doing now without them. So definitely give a huge shout out to them too. But thank you for attending. And yep, there's one on Thursday if you want to come to that too. And I think I'm gonna turn off the recording.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.